Welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm your host, Ben Plumley, and this is a podcast about global health and human rights. Now, this set of episodes is produced in partnership with the Bay Area Global Health Alliance, a group of businesses, biotech and technology, local and international NGOs, all committed to improving the health and the lives of people around the world. You can find out more about the Bay Area Global Health Alliance at their website, www.bayareaglobalhealth.org. Well, in this episode, we meet Jeff Sturchio, the Chief Executive Officer of Rabin Martin, a global health strategy and advocacy agency. Jeff has had a sterling career in global health. He led access to medicine efforts at the pharmaceutical company Merck, and he went on to be the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Health Council. Jeff, in my opinion, is one of the most wise and encyclopedic minds in the fight against pandemics. Jeff, welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast.
Well, it's great to be with you.
I got to say, this is, Jeff, you are a guest I have wanted to have on the show for a very long time. I remember the conversations, some of them heated, that you and I used to have in the WHO cafe in the WHO headquarters in Geneva. And here we are on either side of the United States, connected by technology in 2020, and I suppose largely caused by the double whammy of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I just wonder, to kick this off, how do you feel these two sort of seismic events are transforming the way you're thinking about global health and human rights?
Well, first, again, thank you for inviting me to join you for this conversation. It's interesting. I was the last 10 days have really been remarkable in the way in which the incident in Minneapolis with George Floyd has sort of sparked all kinds of action across the United States and across the world as people are rightly protesting the incidents of police brutality and how it's really illuminated longstanding questions of structural racism in the U.S. And I think, and I'd like to draw a connection between that and global health, because and the route through that is understanding social determinants of health. So where people live, learn, work, and play, the environment they live in, where they're housed, as I said, unemployment, economic inequality. Those are all aspects of what create vulnerability in health and lead to health inequities around the world. So, Sandro Galea, who's the dean of the Boston University School of Public Health, wrote a book recently called Well, which looks at the impact of understanding social determinants on how we think about health. And, he points out that the conditions that produce poor health are also the forces that create a world that shapes health. And those forces include not just the ones I mentioned, but also, underlying forces like racism, sexism, homophobia, economic inequality. So if we're really going to help people who are vulnerable and don't have access to healthcare resources because of these kinds of underlying forces that structure the world we live in, we really have to work on those as well, because they're inextricably linked to health equity. So, what Sandro, if I can just quote a couple of lines in this book, he says, creating a healthier world means creating a more just alignment of the conditions that shape health. Without the core aim of justice, we cannot effectively pursue health. So I think that, addressing questions like the ones that have been brought up in the last 10 days around structural racism and the need to deal with that are also of a piece with understanding what needs to be done to improve health around the world, which is what I spend most of my time thinking about and working on. So I think it's very relevant to what we're trying to do more broadly in global health, and it's also relevant to the COVID-19 epidemic. I mean, just to give you an example, in the U.S., in a recent study that was coordinated by AMFAR, they found that Black Americans have been affected as 1/3 of the COVID-19 deaths in the U.S., but the Black population is only 13% of the U.S. population. So it's 2.5 times the level of risk of dying of COVID-19. And they've also found that 1/5 of the counties in the U.S., all of which are, that is, 1/5 of the counties in the U.S. are disproportionately black in terms of population distribution, but those account for nearly half of all the cases and more than half of all the deaths. So you can see how these issues that people are protesting are also relevant for understanding what we need to do about health. And
And
I think that's an
it's been
important point.
really interesting to see how this has become sort of a global wave.
Hmm.
You mentioned the research on the impact of COVID on African American communities. The research in the United Kingdom is looking at, is demonstrating that as well for Black and South Asian communities who are
Hmm.
disproportionately affected. And, and at the end of the day, this just points more than ever for folks like you and me who've been committed to global solidarity that if a virus is spreading out of control 4,000 miles away from your hometown or your fort in Washington D.C.
Yeah.
with fences and unmarked militiamen around them, you haven't dealt with it. I mean, one of the other reasons I really wanted to get you on the show is that I think you have an incredible, clear-sighted and sort of inspired thinking around things. I've always deeply appreciated that, and I think in part my thinking is that this comes from your early upbringing, your academic background, and indeed your activist background. Could you share a bit about that?
Sure. Well, first, it's kind of you to say that you think I have a clear-eyed view of these issues and the way to think about them. But maybe part of it does have to do with my academic background. Uh, I was another way of putting it is everything I know about global health has been on the job training, because I was a history major as an undergraduate at Princeton. I discovered the history of science when I was a freshman at Princeton, and I'd started off to be a chemist and switched to history of science. And then I went off and got a PhD in the history and sociology of science at the University of Pennsylvania. So I've always been interested in, in looking at issues of science, technology, and medicine through an historical lens. And I was a college professor for after I left the university with my new PhD, and I stayed in the academic world for a number of years before. In fact, I often describe myself as a recovering academic. So but I went into the business world in 1988. I joined AT&T Bell Labs. I stayed there for a little over a year, and then went to Merck, where I spent 20 years. And that's when your our listeners may be interested to know that's when you and I met, because we were working on HIV/AIDS, from different perspectives, but we were thrown together on the same issues, and have worked together ever since. But it was, I remember once when I first went to Merck, I was talking to one of the senior executives at some dinner, and he asked me, "Are you a writer, or are you a what was the other thing he said? Or are you a policy guy?" But he had this view of the world that there were only certain roles that people could play, and he knew I wasn't a scientist, and he knew I wasn't, an engineer. So he had a limited set of categories to put me in. But what was great about the nearly 20 years I spent at Merck was that, certainly with HIV and AIDS, I was thrown right in. It's been 25 years now since I first started to work on HIV. But I was thrown right into a team that was trying to figure out how to bring Crixivan, Indinavir, to the market. And we started, the way that I got into that work was I was part of a small team that engaged with some key players in the HIV treatment information community. People
And
like
I think
Marty.
that's where I really got to meet you. And I think in those days, way back when, I was working for one of your competitors, what was then
Mm,
called Glaxo Wellcome. And I guess a question I've always wanted to ask you is, uh, uh, why are the humanities so essential to the sciences? It has always struck me that we've been playing this role of bringing what goes on in the quiet of an enclosed laboratory to the
mm.
general public, and almost the vice versa, bringing what's going on in the general public into the thinking that goes on to research and development.
Yeah, no, that's true. And Well, it's a good thing that scientists are focused on their lab bench because that's how they come up with the bright ideas and the new products that, when we were in the pharmaceutical industry, we were trying to play a small role in bringing those to more people around the world to ensure that, if they had a life-threatening condition, they could live through it, or they could, really get life-extending therapies if it was a chronic disease. But it's and it's a rare scientist who actually can bridge that gap and explain what he or she has been doing to a broader public. But another way of looking at it, and maybe it's just given the roles we had as well as the kind of backgrounds that we brought to it. But what I found in my career is that large corporations are some of the most insular institutions on the planet. And despite what they say, and if you just think of the slogans of some large pharmaceutical companies, they claim to be all about helping patients, putting patients first. But what most people inside those companies spend their time thinking about is when can I get this PowerPoint presentation ready for my boss the day after tomorrow? I've got to go to a meeting of this task force this afternoon, and where's the agenda? And but it's all inwardly focused, and it has to do just with the day-to-day business of doing the work that is required to get new HIV medicines out, or new cancer medicines out, or if you're in another company, making sure you have the snazziest sneakers to sell to consumers. So in the roles that I had when I was at Merck, I was really put in a position where I had to think carefully about what do different publics expect from a company like ours, and how can we use the vast resources we had and the kinds of capabilities in the personalities of our scientists and our clinicians. How can we use those to do more good in the world? And so it was, and it was helpful to have that kind of role. You played a similar role at your company too, and also at another one that you worked for. And I think that we need more of that. That kind of translation, so that we understand what's happening in the outside world and how that affects both how companies go about their work, but also how they understand the expectations of others. I started to say a few minutes ago that I was first introduced to the world of HIV and AIDS when I was one of a large team that was working on Indinavir. And my colleagues at the time, John Dorley and Linda Distelrath, really had started this engagement with the HIV community. And the interesting thing was that there were lots of people inside the company, some of them at very senior levels, who thought this was a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
This is the age of, in the mid 90s, this is ACT UP and lots of demonstrations. And it wasn't so many years since Larry Kramer and Peter Staley and lots of other people had tried to close down the FDA, and demonstrations in the New York stock market, die-ins all over the place. So there were executives who were really wary about this engagement. But in the end, it became clear that that engagement was critical both to the development of our clinical program, because this group of treatment information activists like Jules Levin and Marty Delaney and a number of others who met with us almost on a monthly basis together with the senior scientists, raised really important and sensible questions about, were we thinking about this? And, clinicians have a tendency to underplay adverse experiences, but for them, and some of them were already on early HIV medicines like DDI and DDC and AZT, for them, peripheral neuropathy wasn't just jargon. It meant that their fingers and toes were numb, and it was
it was
terrible.
day and life issues.
Yeah.
And I think what's interested me so much about that time was that we were this intersection in a fundamental change of philosophy, that your customers were no longer doctors. Your customers actually were the end users, were patients. And I think originally, probably for very good moral reasons, the idea that pharmaceutical companies shouldn't interact with patients made sense, maybe
Mm-hmm.
in the 1950s. But by the 1990s, an informed, assertive patient community, and I've realized it wasn't just HIV, it's been happening across a range of diseases, that model just didn't work anymore. And you described the industry as being very, very inward. And I think the other thing that I experienced, that even with the best will in the world, it can be very, very slow to change, even if it wants to change.
Mm.
And so the idea that you would bring in patients and speak about patients, that the experiences that patients have, and actually engage them in design of clinical trials and right into the R&D process, was something that was becoming very revolutionary.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's true. And since then, in the last 25 years, you've seen that approach, or that uh, the method of engaging with the communities who are most directly affected, has become widespread in, whether it's people with asthma, people living with diabetes, people living with cancer. Engaging with the relevant patient communities is now just part of how the industry tries to do business. I think there are, in my opinion, the what's missing now that was very much present in the 90s when we first started speaking with treatment advocates and others in the HIV community, is that there is such a complex web of compliance that's now been spun around relationships between individual companies and the patient communities, that I think something is lost.
Yeah.
Nobody disagrees that this has to be done according to a clear set of rules. And in most cases I can think of, those rules have been well observed. But I think that because companies now, find it, basically all of these compliance issues that have been raised in recent years have really made it difficult for companies to get the full benefit of engaging with patients.
And then we should just sort of clarify what those compliance requirements are. And I think I guess they come from some of the more notable, notorious experience, say with the opioid crisis
Mm-hmm.
and others, that you can't be seen to be influencing or
Mm.
bribing patients and doctor groups. But
Yeah.
Jeff, you beat me to it by having a quote. I've got one written up specially for you, and it sort of, I think, speaks to the moment that we're in. And as you'd expect from me, it's from Aldous Huxley,
Mm-hmm.
from one of the collections of essays, and the quote is that men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important of all the lessons of history. And 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 so we're sort of getting into this conversation, essentially recollecting what we did. It is really amazing to me that we've done such a sloppy job in documenting what happened, what was achieved, and
Mm-hmm.
what was, and indeed what the challenges were. And I think the area that really struck me in my collaboration with you when you were at Merck. I was briefly then at Glaxo Wellcome and then at UNAIDS.
Mm.
That's really where I interacted with you, working for Peter Piot, then the executive director of UNAIDS, is that as we looked at the companies that were coming into talk to us about improving access to medicines, and actually that might be not the best way of describing it, in collaborating in improving access to care generally, and looking at the core competencies that they could bring. You undoubtedly had a range of people, and approaches, and I would say that on one hand there was your boss at the time, Perwold Olsen, and the chief executive officer, Rabin Martin,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a sense there of, you guys dreamed big, but you had sort of a step-by-step plan on how to get there. And then on the other hand, the other extreme, you had folks who really believed in the primacy of intellectual property, that IP wasn't a tool in order to improve health. It was the thing that you needed to defend at all costs.
Mm.
And in a short period of time, your colleagues, I think, a really seminal historical moment. Two might be interchangeable, I admit, but the idea that there was one global price and that there shouldn't be differential
Mm.
pricing, that was a sort of a holy sacrament that
Mm-hmm.
got defeated. And of course, the other one was working with generics companies, and there was such movement in the early 2000s some of it, I think, that movement has not sort of adequately reflected the contributions made by brand named companies
Hmm.
themselves. And I just wondered what your sense of that moment in history was.
Well, it was, it was, we think back to that. Now I'm thinking around, the year 2000, 2001, when things really came to a head. There was, remember in 1997, the pharmaceutical industry saw that it was, in its wisdom, decided to sue Nelson Mandela over how the South African government treated intellectual property on pharmaceutical products. And by 2000, it was clear that, this was killing their reputation around the world, and something had to be done. And so, together with many others, you and many others, I was involved in helping to find a way to change the industry's position and really have a much more realistic approach to these issues. Because it turned out, after all, that when companies implemented differential pricing, when they started to look at what had to be done practically to improve access to care and treatment for people living with HIV in African countries, the sky didn't fall in. It's the intellectual property system didn't crumble around them. And conversely, it became clear that even when the WTO made it possible for countries to implement TRIPS flexibilities and issue compulsory licenses, that didn't solve the problem either, because there were so many other dimensions of how to ensure access to medicines for people who at that time still didn't have access. So I think what was critical was finding a way to work together across geographic boundaries, across disciplinary boundaries, and across sectoral boundaries. I mean, in other words, you needed to have a real collaboration of everybody who had resources and expertise to add to the solutions to this set of problems. And it was, I think what I remember some of the things that were really interesting at the time. I mean, first of all, and you'll recall this too, when the Accelerating Access Initiative was started in 2000, there really hadn't been very good communication among UN agencies who had an interest in this problem and among the companies. Mm. And of course there hadn't been dialogue with the community either. And I think one of the things that came out of that, and what we've learned over the last 20 years, is that, you have to have that kind of dialogue because, these are classic examples of what Kofi Annan used to call problems without passports. And,
Yeah.
They're so complex and so daunting that if you just stay in traditional silos and don't work together, it's hard to find what he also called solutions without borders.
Now, you
So,
just talked about the Accelerating Access Initiative, which was essentially a group of pharmaceutical companies interested in HIV working with the UN to try and move the needle forward.
mm-hmm.
As you look back at that time, who are the sort of who influenced you? Who sort of helped drive your thinking in those days?
Well, it was a long process. I mean, first of all, as I said earlier, I was really impressed and affected by the dialogue that we were having with leaders in the HIV community. It made it clear to me that you had to look at this really complex and existential issue through the eyes of others who were more directly affected. And that was hard to do from where I sat in a large multinational pharmaceutical company, but through that mechanism that started that kind of dialogue. And then that led us, when, as you said before, we were trying to do more with because we knew that that this medicine, indinavir, was going to have an important role. In fact, in 1996, a year or so later, when it was first introduced, you'll recall at the Vancouver AIDS conference, it was revolutionary that triple combination antiretroviral therapy was having such an immediate impact on people who were living with HIV and, in fact, had come to the stage where they had AIDS, and and all of a sudden, in a matter of months, if they were able to get access to that therapy, it was they used to talk about the Lazarus effect. Mm. So that was one thing. The other was, and it was probably not until a couple of years later when we really, when at Merck at least, when we realized that we had to do something to get this new medicine not just to people in the U.S. and Western Europe, but then as now, most of the people who were affected lived in Africa, and so we had to do something to get this medicine to Africa. So that's when we reached out to Peter and UNAIDS in Geneva and started to Jos Perriens was also part of that discussion, Bernard Schwartlander. So it was getting to know more from the perspective of those of you who were working at the center of the institutional response, at least the multilateral institutional response.
Yeah, and not to forget the late Julia Cleaves,
Of course,
who was very much part of that.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
as I was trying to sort of meld all these different viewpoints together, I mean, you were a huge influence on me. I'd say, and I wouldn't really sort of say from the other side, but of course there were a group of activists and lawyers who were very dismissive of the intellectual property laws and frameworks. But Ellen Terhune, who went on to be the head of the Medicines Patent Pool for a while, I believe she recently actually got an honor from the Kingdom of the Netherlands for her work in access to medicines. But I remember meeting with her just as the Medicines Patent Pool was being formed, and she was thinking, "Oh, I'm going to have a really tough time convincing Ben of what we're trying to do."
Yeah.
And I went in there thinking, she's just, she and I are not going to have any areas of agreement at all. And to our surprise, I would say almost to our horror, we found ourselves agreeing that yes, the idea of having an organized way of providing technology transfer from the originator company and then making it available through a series of licenses made perfect sense. So that era for me, whether it was expertise from industry, and as well as you and the people at Merck, I'd sort of include Paul Stoffels, who was then at Tibotec and then went on to play such a key role in J&J. So there was him, there was you, then there were people like Ellen, and not to forget, people like Kate Thompson, who then went on to the Global Fund, who was precisely one of those people whose lives had been saved after 1996 by triple therapy, but who made it their mission to say, well, if I have this, everybody needs to have it. One of the other things that you and I did in the early to mid 2000s was get heavily involved in the business response to AIDS more generally. And we were seeing this rapid transformation from sort of old school philanthropy. Let's just send a couple of Land Rovers to Kenya and slap our logo on them. Through to sort of more corporate responsibility, and I think it's still evolving still into good corporate business practice. But as you look at the stuff that happened then, the mobilization of the broader business community, this was an area where you and I would sometimes get into some interesting conversations because we had to do what we could to mobilize the energy industry, the manufacturing industries, heavy industry, and let me put the question to you again now. I mean, do you think it was all bullshit, or do you think we were actually doing something?
Well, yeah, no, I think no, I don't think it was all bullshit because I think that the kind of dialogue that the GBC helped to catalyze and the work
and
that
GBC there is the Global Business Coalition on HIV/AIDS, and now it's GBC Health with a broader mandate.
But the dialogue that you and your colleagues catalyzed, the leadership that you showed in persuading many companies, banks and energy companies and others who didn't believe initially they had a direct interest in health, was really important because, as I said before, these kinds of problems without passports, or what sociologists call wicked problems, really need all the relevant expertise and resources that we can muster to solve. And let's face it, it became clear that HIV really was everybody's business. I remember think for instance, a great example is the work that Brian Brink did when he was chief medical officer at Anglo American. Here's a company you would think had no interest in HIV/AIDS, except for the fact that a large proportion of its workforce in mines in southern Africa was HIV positive, and they were having trouble maintaining the productivity of their mines, which is a core element of their business. So, but Brian sort of single-handedly tackled that problem and forced the company to take this seriously, to look at what they could do for the miners and their families and the communities in which they operated to prevent and treat HIV, and later realized that HIV/TB co-infection was a continuing problem, and so they also worked on TB. So that's sort of the paradigm case of why this is, even for a mining company, these kinds of health issues are really important. And I think that notion has become, just as we were talking before about how relationships with patient communities has now become a standard practice within the industry as a result of a lot of the work that was done on HIV. I think that the examples, some of the salient examples from when the Global Business Coalition on HIV/AIDS started working with a wide range of companies, has also become much more widespread. I mean, let's face it. For instance, Peter Sands, who's now the head of the Global Fund, or the executive director of the Global Fund, came out of Standard Chartered Bank, and Standard Chartered was one of the companies that was very active in the GBC some years
Oh,
ago.
yeah. Standard Chartered was one of the first banking businesses to
Mm-hmm.
join. Now, there's a huge figure as we talk about the Global Business Coalition and the business response to AIDS, who sort of came into this like a whirlwind in
It's true.
2001. And you remember that Peter Piot assigned me to him to be his executive director of the Global Business Coalition. And I'm thinking of the late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke.
Yeah.
And, you were immensely helpful to me as I was pulling my hair out in those days. Holbrooke had this desire to test everybody, just get
Mm-hmm.
people tested and the problem will go away. And I remember, and actually it might have been over some slightly stronger drinks than coffee or tea, trying to find ways of sort of managing that expectation. So it's a question I've always been dying to ask you, Jeff. Do you think Holbrooke helped or hindered the cause?
I think he definitely helped, because as it happens, he wasn't wrong that testing was critical. And it was also important for him to bring this to corporate leaders and get them to see that it was something that they should consider supporting. Because as we know now, looking back on those years, it's the fact that testing, point of care testing became widespread for detecting whether people had HIV infection, that became a critical component of an effective response to the HIV epidemic. If we just switch back to where we started thinking about COVID-19, if you just think about the disastrous way in which testing was rolled out for COVID-19 infection, we just don't have the knowledge. What became one of the principles in the HIV world to really mount an effective response was know your epidemic. And without testing, you couldn't know the epidemic. You couldn't know which key populations were affected. You couldn't know where transmission was happening. And it was hard to organize a response that made efficient use of the available resources.
But the big difference with HIV back then is that we suddenly had something we could offer. No longer were we saying to people, "Oh, you've just got to use a condom and cross your legs and hope you stay safe." We actually had treatment, and so I think the real challenge for us was to connect the sort of the public health imperative around testing, know your epidemic, with being able to offer something in the context of a disease with incredible stigma and discrimination. So that's what really made it, I think, for me then.
Yeah, no, and so just staying with that analogy for a minute, we're in the the pre-ART phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we're starting to see, like with remdesivir from Gilead, that there are some treatments that appear to be useful, and we're hopeful that we're going to have a COVID-19 vaccine sometime within the next year, let's just say. That statement alone is controversial because there's some who say it's a matter of months as opposed to a matter of years. And let's hope that those who think it's sooner rather than later are correct, because that'll be hugely important. But we do still, with COVID-19, we have a set of public health countermeasures that have actually been effective in some countries at curtailing the spread of the epidemic. Hand washing, using testing, contact tracing people who we know are positive, isolation of those people from people who aren't yet positive, as well as social distancing and sharing accurate information about the spread of the disease. So, and those have made a big difference in some countries, and in other countries that haven't implemented those, you might call it combination prevention. The disease has been running more or less unimpeded, and that's a big problem. But so there are things we can do. But you're absolutely right that that having effective therapies really changed the game for HIV.
Now, in the second part of the 2000s, you and I were heavily involved in the setting up of and sort of implementation of what I believe the UK activist and sexual reproductive health advocate Robin Garner called the global health architecture, which was this rash of new and existing multilateral agencies, whether it was the Global Fund against AIDS, TB, and malaria, UNITAID. There was UNAIDS, which of course had come in 1996. We had the US PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And then within the UN family, we had, WHO, UNICEF, UNDP. And that's an alphabet soup. That's a lot of acronyms going on there. And I remember you and I having conversations about whether it made sense for there to be so many organizations. And you teasing me that I was trying to find a logic to justify the existence of what were essentially fiefdoms. And so, Jeff, did that global health infrastructure make sense then? Does it make sense now?
Yeah, well, I think in a way, it was almost inevitable because one of the things we haven't talked about much is politics. But even at the level of multilateral organizations and the UN, and what appears to be just a technical question, how do we learn how to deal with the healthcare problems that affect people around the world? And what are the technical things we need to know, and the normative guidance on that to do the best job that we can with available resources? That can't be divorced from the politics of these multilateral organizations. So what had happened by 2000 or so is, WHO, which is a member state organization, was getting to the point where on certain key issues, you just could not get consensus. And so, and also because WHO was then as now, was strained by the limited resources they had available to essentially deal with the entire health agenda around the world. That just exacerbated the kind of political tensions there were within the member states about what WHO's best role should be. And so I think in that context, it made a lot of sense to have a Gavi that could really focus on immunization that was, killing too many children before the age of 5. It made sense to have a UNAIDS because, we know from the book by Mike Merson and Erig, the early story of the separation of UNAIDS from the WHO's global program on AIDS, that WHO was beset by these kinds of political challenges in addressing HIV and AIDS, not least because of the stigma and discrimination around it that you mentioned before. But it made sense for WHO to cede the coordinating function to UNAIDS, which still, most people don't realize. You know this because you worked at UNAIDS, but most people don't realize that the rationale for UNAIDS was to coordinate all of the UN agencies' activities around HIV and AIDS.
It's called herding cats on heat.
Yeah, that's probably a better description of what the reality was like. But and UNAIDS has made a tremendous contribution to to really fighting back against the epidemic over the past almost 25 years now. And the same, you could go through each of these specialized agencies. The Global Fund was to put the spotlight on the need for sustainable financing for fighting AIDS, TB, and malaria. And it was able to do that in a way because if the Global Fund has only that role, then it doesn't have to fight everybody else with a vested interest within WHO to get more money for AIDS, TB, and malaria. So I think that they were, they were innovations that were fit for purpose at the time and have done a lot of good. But I think you ask a good question. So here we are in 2020. We're beset with the largest health crisis in a century with the coronavirus pandemic. And is this global health architecture now fit for purpose for dealing with a global challenge like that? And I think that one of the things to keep in mind, another thing to keep in mind about the history of the last 20 years as the global health architecture has evolved is that some of the things that we've learned are that multi-sectoral action is better than not having multi-sectoral action because it enables governments to bring in the multilateral organizations and communities who are directly affected and the private sector as well. So you can actually have a much more systematic approach to these issues. It's also part of a trend or it reflects a trend in global development more generally. It used to be, when the WHO was created, there were the first world and the third world, and then it became developed countries and developing countries. But it was always this sort of, donor-beneficiary relationship. So there was a certain hierarchy in the relationship that now, as a result of HIV/AIDS and the work that's been done through Gavi and the Global Fund, that also plays into this broader trend in looking at countries that are not as economically developed as the OECD as partners in development, not that one is a beneficiary and one is a donor. And that perspective, I think, is important as we head forward. And then finally, those agencies that we talked about, Gavi and UNAIDS and the Global Fund and others, show the need for effective global coordination. So I think what's most critical is that, and this is the role that had been allocated to WHO back in the 40s and it continued to play, is you need to have an agency that can coordinate all of these resources, that is prepared to deal with emerging health crises, that can, step in and bring all of the resources together in a way that deals effectively with those.
Absolutely. And I think as we look forward into the next decade, the coordination is going to be the key. Whether it's WHO, I don't know. I think they play an invaluable role in setting normative guidance, particularly for emerging economies to set health priorities. I think that has been, truly one of the Bretton Woods achievements, in the last 60, 70 years. Yeah. But then I got to ask you, the US withdrawing its support from the WHO, how much of a good idea was that?
Well, I mean, I just don't understand it. It's crazy. It's self-defeating. First of all, how is it better for the U.S. not to be part of the organization that brings the global community together to address a health crisis like COVID-19? Because it just means that we've seen already, and let me, not to put too fine a point on it, I don't think the U.S. response to COVID-19, certainly at the level of the administration, has been anything to write home about. There have been failures in testing, failures in, coordinating production of PPEs and ventilators. We're still having fights over how much testing should be done and who's going to coordinate it. And then, it was at the center, it made this false dichotomy between economic recovery and the public health problems, which I just think is one reason that you see the outbreak or the pandemic having gotten to the point that it has in the U.S. So in that context, why would we want to divorce ourselves from others who are trying to solve this problem on a global level? Because at the end of the day, Ken Frazier gave an interesting interview last week, in part in response to
and Ken Frazier, the CEO of Merck, the current CEO of Merck.
Yeah. And what Ken said with respect to the COVID epidemic is, until all of us are safe, none of us are safe.
Yeah.
And I think he's absolutely right. So it's that's why I said that President Trump's decision to pull support from WHO, and let's not go into what the alleged reasons were, but it first of all it shows again the point I made before that you can't separate politics from pandemic response. But at the end of the day, it's not in the U.S. national interest because as long as there's COVID-19 anywhere in the world, there's still a possibility that's going to have an impact on the U.S. So we should be doing everything we can to work together with other countries to solve this problem.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It makes no sense to me, and I'll not get into it at this point. But moving forward now, Jeff, you're the CEO of Rabin Martin, which is a health policy, strategy, and communications agency. I've had the
Mm-hmm.
privilege of working with it, being one of its clients in the past. What do you do there? What are your priorities?
Well, what we try to do, in a nutshell, is bring together private sector capabilities with unmet public health needs. And so a lot of our work involves helping to set up partnerships so that our clients, who tend to be companies, can work with civil society and with governments and with multilateral organizations to do more than they ever thought they could do to address access to medicines and to really help improve health systems around the world and to try to just shape the global health environment in a way that more people can get access to care and treatment and live healthier and longer lives. So we're really focused on underserved populations, whether in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world. A lot of our work is centered in sub-Saharan Africa and in India, but we also work on HIV in the southeastern U.S., for instance, and the way in which stigma, discrimination, health inequalities affect the response to HIV. So, for instance, now one of the issues that's coming up is pre-exposure prophylaxis and how that can be used more systematically to prevent HIV infection in the first place. And we're very interested in where we started this interview when I was talking about social determinants of health and the way in which fundamentally you have to think about issues of social justice to understand the underlying causes of inequity that lead to health disparities. So it's those disparities that we focus on, and we try to help our clients do what they can to overcome those disparities.
Jeff, another area that you and I had worked on. I mean, we never really had the science never quite delivered the AIDS vaccine, but we were all
Mm-hmm.
interested in the preparation work, vaccine preparation work. The way we're going to get out of COVID-19 is going to be around one, possibly more vaccines that are going to have billions and billions of doses.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think we're going to be able to deliver this?
Well, it goes back to a theme that we talked about earlier, which is it's going to require partnerships at every level, because first of all, just again, what's unprecedented about the COVID pandemic or the coronavirus pandemic is that the speed and the scope of its spread is, people say, well, the 1918 flu pandemic killed many more people. That's true, but it wasn't a global pandemic, because there were many countries that weren't affected by it. So obviously, it had a greater impact in those countries that were affected. But here, because of globalization in the intervening century, nobody can escape the impact of COVID-19, and that's become clear just in the last few months. And so it's going to require, and it is already requiring a lot of partnerships at the national and global level to address this. But the same thing is going to be true once we do find a safe and effective vaccine. And I think that it's been remarkable to see how quickly the entire research community, both public and private, has responded to this. We have, within just a couple of months of having identified the genomic sequence of the coronavirus itself, we had something like 100 different vaccines in development, and there were already about 300 plus clinical trials of different medicines to see if they'd be useful against coronavirus. And so that's great. And also there have been specific partnerships set up to accelerate the development of diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. The Gates Foundation was quick out of the box with their accelerator that involved MasterCard and Dell and a bunch of pharmaceutical companies to see if they could quickly find something that would work. There was the NIH has the active collaboration, which again involves many government scientific agencies along with 15 or 16 biopharmaceutical companies to accelerate the progress toward diagnostics and new medicines and a vaccine. The EU has put their Innovative Medicines Initiative resources at the service of finding COVID solutions. And of course, the WHO is leading this, a multilateral approach to trying to do the same thing, to accelerate solutions so that we can apply them as quickly as possible.
I'm really interested in your thoughts on the European initiative, which was a sort of a great big raffle ticket, if you like, a great big bingo party for CEPI, the Norwegian based vaccine preparedness group. And do you see a sort of a rise of Europeans filling the void left perhaps by American leadership in pushing vaccine research into COVID?
Yeah, well, I think it's the reason I mentioned those four is that it's really a fairly global effort to catalyze research and development of new tools against COVID-19. And the Europeans obviously are playing their part. And, it was encouraging to see that Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, led that pledging conference at the beginning of May. So that was a good sign. And European countries have certainly been stepping up because, we know they've been directly affected in serious ways. But I think what, this is going to get back to a problem that we've discussed about the need for coordination. Because they're all trying to do the same thing, and they're all working with the same companies, and they're all tracking the same virus. So we have to find a way to make sure that the EU efforts aren't duplicating efforts that are happening in the US, and vice versa. And also let's not forget that there are skills and resources in Africa and Southeast Asia that should be part of this search as well.
Absolutely.
And it's and so, not only will, clinical trials will have to be held in other parts of the world just to make sure that that whatever vaccines are successful, there aren't some esoteric adverse experiences that only affect certain kinds of populations, or certain populations. But also, those additional skills and that additional creativity will help us come up with better solutions. But the point I was going to make about that is, so we're seeing, this rapid investment in finding solutions. CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, is a good example. I mean, they have made early investments in some of the vaccines and other projects that are going on, and that will have an important catalytic effect. And actually, more money came in for CEPI at the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, or Gavi, replenishment just a couple of days ago. So those are all encouraging signs. But let's say, to use a somewhat, I don't mean to sound flippant, but what happens if the dog catches the car? What if we do have a new COVID-19 vaccine, and we realize that it's actually going to be useful for about 7 billion people? But there has never been a vaccine that's been distributed to 7 billion people in a finite period of time. So the question then becomes, what do you have to do to ensure global access to a safe and effective vaccine that can actually help, if not stop the epidemic in its tracks, at least really slow it down significantly and make it less deadly for people who do catch COVID-19 infections.
It's going to force on us a solidarity, a pandemic solidarity that we had perhaps predicted 20 years ago was needed, but it's going to have to be implemented at rapid pace. Yeah. Back to your point that not sorting out infections in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa is going to have a huge impact on whether we as a global society end up dealing with the pandemic. Yeah. There was one other thing I wanted to raise with you, and it's a comment that Jonathan Quick, who we used to know at the WHO, He's been talking about the need for pandemics literacy,
Mm-hmm.
something that essentially has to inform pretty much every aspect of our policy and budgeting over the next few years.
Yeah.
The idea that COVID may well be the pandemic we were fearful of, but there will be others. And
Yeah.
so it seems to me that there's going to have to be an utter transformation in the way we think about, incentivize, and budget for this impact of globalization, this impact of the clash of humanity and
Yeah.
climate.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Ben. And one thing that's certain in this time of coronavirus is that it's not the last pandemic that we will face. So that preparedness, the focus on preparedness, is absolutely critical. And Peter Piot put this well in an interview a couple of months ago. He said, the time to build a fire department is not when your house is on fire. That's interestingly enough, Bill Foege, who is a former CDC director who wrote a memoir about his role in smallpox eradication, called the book House on Fire. The difference between what we've seen with COVID-19 so far and smallpox eradication in the 1970s is that in the 1970s, that campaign to eliminate smallpox actually had all the elements that we've been talking about that need to be part of our approach to COVID-19. The coordination, the partnerships, and I won't repeat all of them, but it's an interesting historical analogy. And just to come back briefly to what are we going to do once we have a COVID vaccine? Because what I think the manufacturers or the researchers and manufacturers are going to be then worrying about global access have to do is, number one, they have to plan for it from the beginning. So it's no good to say, well, we've got this vaccine, we have a certain number of doses, we'll take care of the US, the UK, and the EU first, and then we'll worry about the rest of the world. No, I mean, we learned the hard way in HIV and AIDS that that's just not acceptable to the people who are living with this disease and who rightly feel that their lives are just as important as lives in the global north. The second is that I hope we'll also learn the lesson that companies shouldn't remain in their shell, be isolated in the way that I was talking about earlier, but that they should really reach out to governments, to communities who are affected, to civil society generally, and get their ideas on what would be equitable ways of distributing the vaccine as we have it. And also, we've seen already that AstraZeneca, for instance, is thinking about this because at the Gavi replenishment a few days ago, they announced a deal with the Serum Institute of India to make another 1 billion doses of the vaccine they're working on with Oxford University, if it turns out to be safe and effective. But they're doing that now so that they can begin to scale up to distribute it more broadly when it is proven to be safe and effective, rather than starting then. They're taking the risk now, but they're also thinking about, what about India? What about Africa? And how are we going to make sure that people there have access to a vaccine? And I think the last point I just want to emphasize is, we've seen, and this is a thread that's run through our conversation, but, we have to look at this through an equity lens and realize that, and with COVID, it's so much more important because nobody's immune from it. I mean, some are now, having lived through the experience of having COVID-19, but basically no nation is immune. Most people on the planet are still at risk of COVID-19 infection. And if we have a vaccine that is safe and effective, it's only right to make sure that we find ways to get it to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And then that comes back to the point you made about pandemics literacy, because one of the things that we've got to start thinking about more seriously is how to manage expectations of a global population about how and when they'll get access to a vaccine or to new drugs. And part of the problem here is that hardly anybody really knows how COVID attacks the body.
Right.
So they're just basic issues about the pathophysiology of coronavirus that, I mean, scientists are only just learning now, but we've got to find ways to translate that knowledge to the broad population so that they understand how to protect themselves. And we've seen many examples over the last couple of weeks as economies begin to open up, where people are acting as if they're immune
Yeah.
and won't be affected. But this virus doesn't care whether your governor in the U.S. decides that you can now go to phase 2 and reopen non-essential businesses. It's just looking for opportunities to infect other humans, and it does that pretty efficiently.
I
So
think
that's
this is the perhaps the great tragedy of the modern era, of this modern era, that we have
mm,
so reduced ad absurdum our attention span for news and for information, that the idea of us having to fly an aeroplane while we are still building it, that there will need to be some long-term attention that we as the general public have to pay to this, is something that's going to be very hard, but I think very good for us as a
yeah,
society to
yeah,
embrace.
yeah, and it's all the more important because the experts tell us that COVID may not be a pandemic forever, but it's likely to become an endemic disease, just
Yeah.
like seasonal flu. So it's all the more important for people to understand what they can do to protect themselves from infection. And then the other part of pandemics literacy is most people don't have a clue how vaccines are manufactured, and so in trying to help provide reasonable expectations for what the general population or the general public can expect. I think that kind of education is important too, just so they understand that it's a complex process, that it doesn't always go perfectly, that when people tell them, when you can't get, depending on which expert you talk to or which politician you talk to, you get a wide range of estimates for when these vaccines are going to be available. And it's not because they're trying, they're lying. It's not because they're trying to dissemble. It's because it's a highly contingent process and it's unpredictable, and you just have to be patient, because eventually we'll get there, but it may not be a linear path. And
Right. And perhaps one of the seminal moments in the history of COVID will be a meeting that a certain president of the United States had with a group of industry leaders about vaccine development. And you're going to offer me a vaccine in a year. You're going to offer me a vaccine in 6 months. Any advances on that?
yeah,
Yeah, talk about the need to educate and prepare.
exactly. But let's hope we have those problems soon, because uh, I mean, obviously, it would be great if one of the companies that's in the race right now does come up with a new vaccine as soon as possible.
So it's a question we're asking absolutely everybody who comes on the show. How are you staying safe and sane during this period of lockdown? And I can see immediately there's one thing that you're not doing, which is shaving, and the beard looks very good, by the way, very
Oh,
distinguished.
thank you.
But yeah, so what's your shelter in place strategy?
Yeah, well, I keep busy, obviously. But no, this I started this beard on March 9th, the day that I started working from home. So I'll probably shave it when in the distant future, when we start going back to the office. Um, but obviously, I spend a lot of time on Zoom calls every day, just engaging with our clients, with my team, and try. The other thing I do, which I mean, this is probably more information than anybody needs, but I've always tried to leave at least one day a week where I don't work. So and I'm actually violating that now, because usually I take Saturdays off. But
So what do you do? I imagine you read. You are a
yeah,
voracious collector of books.
yeah.
But anything you've been binge watching on television?
Oh, yeah. Well, I have a weakness for Scandinavian noir TV series. I mean, things like Wallander, and I just started watching Rebecca Martinson, which is Asa Larson is the author. So that's one thing I do. But I do read a lot. In fact, I'm about a third of the way through the second volume of Charles Moore's biography of Margaret Thatcher. And I found, I mean, at the time that Thatcher was in power, I can't say that I was a big fan of hers, but reading this book is fascinating because it really tells you the way that it gives you an inside look in how government actually operates, and how how Thatcher wielded the power that she had. So those are the kinds of things I like to read.
Well, Jeff, we should let you get on to enjoy your one day off of not working. And I, for a minute, cannot believe that's ever been achieved. But Jeff, thank you so much. One, for everything that you do and for what you have done. And thank you so much for giving us the time on this episode on the show. So really appreciate it.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Ben. And maybe we can do this again sometime.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this episode. We hope you enjoyed the show. Our thanks to Jeff Sturchio. Thanks also to Erica Spera, our director from Newsdoc Media. And thanks also to you. If you have any suggestions or comments about this show or any other show, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can find us at Facebook and Twitter at Shot Arm Podcast. And of course, you can find us wherever you download your podcasts. Have a healthy week and a safe week. Thank you.